Mansfield from the University of Melbourne. You will be presenting on language diversification and social signalling in Northern Australia.
Thank you, Laurence. Thanks everybody for being here. I'd particularly like to thank you for some of this, I imagine, last little bit of attention and brain power that you've got left. I guess the tank's almost empty at this point. I just want to highlight before I start that the ideas that I'm sharing today are very much things taught to me by Aboriginal colleagues in Northern Australia. So yeah, I have a great debt in this and in much of the research I do to those people who share a lot of these ideas with me. So I'd like to start with a very familiar observation that language has at least two fundamental functions. We use language to express and describe things about the world, so we've got the referential meaning of language. And then there's a second function, which we can see in these examples here, where I can say, for example, she isn't happy or she ain't happy. And when I make that choice between those two, what I would call negative copular elements, they're actually quite kind of semantically abstract things, but I can choose between isn't and ain't to perform this second function of language, where I'm telling you something about me, what kind of person I am, what kind of attitude or stance I'm taking in this interaction. Okay, so that's very familiar. We're familiar with this idea that language has at least two fundamental functions. I'd like to draw attention to something else, which is, you could also imagine a different kind of alternation between saying something like, I am happy versus happy I am. Language is also full of these kind of differences and changes in the way we order things, but it seems very rare for language to use these kind of ordering differences to do that social function of signaling things about yourself or your identity. It seems very rare. Unless you are a wrinkly green man. If you're a wrinkly old green man, then you are likely to use this kind of variation to signal your identity as a wrinkly old green man. Yoda, for example. And actually, I think it's no accident that in the Star Wars films, when they needed to come up with a conlang, they needed to come up with a special dialect identifying Yoda people, they used this funny kind of ordering trick because it's not a thing we normally find much in natural languages, so it makes it kind of weird and fun. Okay, so what's all this got to do with language diversification? And I'm really happy to be up here just following on from Rosie, actually. So Rosie's been telling us about the way that languages can become different from one another. I'm going to talk about something similar, but I'm going to talk about it in Northern Australia, where it turns out to be some really interesting differences in how it happens. So let's step right back and just ask, at a very fundamental level, how do languages become different from one another anyway? A traditional and intuitive idea is that languages, you have a group of people and they all speak sort of the same language more or less, they share a language, and how do their languages become different? Through the group separating out, drifting apart, losing contact with one another, and once they're no longer talking to each other, that allows their ways of speaking to become different over time. And this is very nicely stated by Herman Paul in a classic work in 1888, where he talks about groups of people ending up in different valleys or in different islands, becoming sharply marked off from those outside them, and he says this is a fundamental principle of how you get different languages in the world. Okay, it seems intuitively obvious. And it's also underlying the classic family tree that we attribute to as our kind of model of language change and language relationships, where those branching points are essentially like a theory that at that point a group of people split into two groups of people and that allowed their languages to drift apart. Plus, the flip side, that once two separate groups of people, for whatever reason, come back together, end up living in the same valley again, and now they're interacting and talking to each other again, that can allow their languages to converge and become more similar due to their contact. Okay, so that's the flip side. Separation and divergence, contact and convergence. This is a classic model. And of course, I'm not going to talk about the classic model today. I'm going to talk about the radical other idea that maybe languages diverge because of social contact and communication between people. And there's plenty of recent linguistic research pointing in this direction. Some of the people in this room have had a big role in that. I'm looking at our director, Nick Evans, who's been a big advocate for these ideas. I've got other people like Ruth Singer. So various parts of the world, you have these intensely multilingual societies, small groups of people living, using each other's languages, and they seem to do a lot to both maintain their linguistic differences and either extend and further the differences in the way they speak, while at the same time being very socially intertwined. Okay, so this is a different idea of how languages can become different. Also, Louisa Michelli, who's worked with Mark Ellison, has recently showed that there are unconscious cognitive processes by which multilingual people's languages actually become more different from one another. So I'm going to talk more about this by looking at some case study from Northern Australia. So this is one of those intensely multilingual areas with these many languages spoken by small groups of people. And there's an area there kind of in the elbow where the language labels don't even fit on the map anymore because there's just too many damn languages in there, and that's the Daly region, which I'll now zoom in on. So this region, and if you want to explore it further, I recommend to you the Daly Languages website produced by Rachel Nordlinger and Ian Green, probably funded by CoEDL. So you can get right into it there. I'm just going to show you this one snapshot. Rosie, I raise you on Vanuatu. 18 languages which represent 5 distinct language families spoken entirely by approximately 10,000 people or so. All right? This is extremely intense language diversity. So as far as we can tell, there are like 5 distinct language families going on just in that area. Now, we call this the Daly language area. Why do we call it that? Because those languages, their vocabularies are different enough that we can't show them to be related beyond these 5 families, but grammatically they're very similar. Phonologically they're also very similar, and so that seems kind of different from Vanuatu. So when I say they're grammatically similar, here's some examples. These are spoken to me by Malvian Claver Dumu, so he's multilingual in Marishevan and Murimpata, and you can never find out how many languages he speaks because he won't admit it to you until the situation comes up. But if he wanted to say, you went fishing yesterday, he would use these sentences, and I've used colour coding, thanks Mark Richards, for showing that in this kind of ordering of elements, these are kind of the same, we can call these like isomorphic structures, or you can call it like a morpheme by morpheme translation. But the actual forms of the words and the morphemes, most of them are completely unrelated. And you find these kind of mirrorings right through these Daly languages, as also highlighted by Rachel in her 2017 chapter. And so we can talk about this Daly language area. Now, so those are completely unrelated languages. So Western Daly, Southern Daly, don't be fooled, they're just like separate language families. Let's now look at some languages that are very closely related. So I'm going to talk about some languages, dialects, Murimpata and Murinkura, which have just widely share their grammars, a lot of shared lexicon, all that kind of thing. They're clearly closely related languages, and they're very geographically close to each other. That's a small number of kilometres between them, and I don't want you to think about these as separate people. These are very intertwined, intermarrying people who are constantly being exposed to both these ways of speaking, Murimpata and Murinkura. So how do they differentiate their ways of speaking? Well, they use a nice, clear, obvious way when they want to talk about salient things in their world, like these important animals. There's quite a lot of vocabulary differences. So they've got different words for things like the emu, or the kookaburra, or butterflies, or talking about dangerous animals in general. So your canonical kind of words, your nouns and adjectives, there's lots of differences between Murimpata and Murinkura, and to some extent you have to dig into the archives to find about these. It was nice being in IAXIS the other day. So those are what you might think of as the obvious ways to differentiate your ways of speaking. But actually, when you get into the more abstract bits of language, there's quite a few differences there as well. So a distal demonstrative is different between them. A relativizer or locative marker is different between them. there's a different verbal prefix that marks first inclusive irialis verbs, and this is a thing that speakers are aware of, and some speakers told me about this difference. So you can see there how you'd use that to conjugate verbs differently. You might say purulilingime or ngam purulilingime. So there's also these differences in grammatical markers. And those kind of differences we find in other very close-by dialect pairings like Marishevan and Marifil. I won't take you through the noun differences, but we actually, just skipping onto the grammatical markers, interestingly kind of similar differences in grammatical markers. Again, a distant demonstrative. Again, the relativized locative marker is slightly different. In this case, there's a verb suffix, which is different between these very close dialects. And you can see that in this verb, if you want to say, I'll do it, ngipini or ngipiwa. So grammatical markers may also play a role here. But I would now like to step back and just ask, why speak differently anyway? And here I can really defer to the people who taught me about these languages. So this is Ngatangai, my adoptive brother, Nguhudir Jeremiah Tanmak. We were very, very honoured to have him down to give us a guest seminar a couple of years ago at University of Melbourne, which he led delivering the seminar in Murimpata. There was some translation in English. And he told us a bit about how he sees language. Now, I got to step back, and this is from Garawura Wanambi giving us a guest lecture in which he really emphasised the way that he sees language as coming out of the land. All right? So it's a very different cosmology or ontology of how language fits into the universe. The linguist's concept of the arbitrariness of the sign, none of the people I work with in Northern Australia are on board with that. Words come very specifically from the world, and they come out of the land, and those people also come out of the land, and they come out of those same places. The mother and father have more like a facilitatory role in you coming into being, but you really come out of the land, okay? And because you come out of that specific place in the land, you have a specific link to that particular word that also comes out of that place in the land. Now, Nguhudir also talked about this in terms of, he used this metaphor, murin yitchit. We can translate that directly as heavy language. And among its many meanings, he uses this when referring to those traditional clan-based dialect differences. If you want to talk about the difference between Murimpata and Murinkura, that's the kind of thing you might talk about. If you mean the traditional Murinkura, you talk about that as Murin Yitchit. And he says that Murin Yitchit, it comes from the roots, much like this plant. I've seen the same metaphor used by M.K. Turner from Central Australia, talking about language from coming out of roots, coming out of the land. Okay. So that's the ontology of language. What about the politics of language? These languages like Murimpata, they're not frozen in time, they're not just in the archives, they're being used day to day by many people living up there. That means they're subject to social change, political dynamics. They're politically volatile entities. Now, people from many of these daily region languages have now moved in, since about the 1940s, moved into a Catholic mission, which is now called Wadia. And that's actually precipitated a large language shift, which came about through politics, a bit of conflict, and essentially Murimpata people saying, well, this mission is on our land, it's in a Murimpata place, and at a certain point they began to impose, you should really speak Murimpata while you're here. Among other things going on with the dormitories and all the kids being put together. So actually, people from all these different languages, after a few generations, now pretty much everyone in Wadia is predominantly speaking Murimpata. So people have kind of started to shift from those traditional alliances and their language reflecting their land. But there is a way that can be overcome. And that is, this is Wurimantipe. When I work with Wurimantipe, or Raphael as I normally call him, in Wadia, he just speaks Murimpata, and a bit of English, but Murimpata mostly. And actually when I work with him in Wadia, so he's really from Mangati Careland, Yep. But when I'm with him in Wadia, he basically says, no, I'm sorry, I just don't know any Mangati Care language. But we only have to get in the troopy and drive, what is it, maybe 30 k's out of Wadia, and as we come on to Magatikere land in Yagyede, Wulimantipe would wind down the window, lean out the window, and start yelling out at the bush, apparently, and is not Murimpata now. He started yelling in Magatikere at the bush, this language that he claims not to know. And that is for a very important reason, that we are now entering Yagyede territory. His ancestors still live there in that land, and he has a moral duty to address those ancestors as we come onto that land. So these languages like Magatikere, which you might say are sort of almost extinct, or whatever you want to call it, or sleeping, they're actually in some ways hanging on by a thread due to people's continuing connection to that land and their moral duties to that land. So this points even more deeply at the reasons why, at least traditionally, it's important for people to use different kinds of words. And as we see, this is subject to all kinds of changes going on in people's worlds. And younger Murimpata speakers are bringing in heaps of English vocabulary. I've counted in some stories, and it's about 25% of content words for some young men speaking are coming in from English and Creole borrowings. And I just want to highlight those young men. It's not because of their bilingualism in English. These same people, in fact, speak very little English, but you don't need that to be able to get the borrowings through the system, okay? So there's heaps of English vocabulary coming in. And when I went up there to research with these young people, I was also very interested in what kinds of contact effects could be happening between those daily languages. Because the current speaker population of Murimpata, like 2/3 or 3/4 of them are actually from those other clans with those different ancestral languages. So I was curious, what proportion of the contemporary vocabulary of Murimpata could have come in from those other languages? Does anybody in the crowd want to have a wild guess? So as 25% content words now come from English, what percent do you think might come from all those other languages which were actually like L2 speakers learning Murimpata over a couple of generations? Do you think that would also be about 25%? Maybe 50%? 10%, 2%? All right. Some of you are getting closer, and I can quantify the answer surprisingly accurately because it's a big fat zero. And this is out of over 100,000 words that we now have in the Murimpata corpus. Thank you to Kurtle, thank you Nick Tiebler and all the corpus people, Wolfgang. In over 100,000 words of contemporary Murimpata corpus data, there is not a single borrowing ever from any of those languages, despite mass language shift from people coming into Murimpata in L2. And this again reinforces the strong cultural, moral, political reasons for choosing your words carefully and distinguishing linguistic forms. And meanwhile, that ordering stuff that I talked about, I said that already in the daily languages they have very similar ordering of elements. There were a few differences. For example, in your verbal suffixes, at least, so older Murimpata speakers recorded decades ago mostly have the tense marker first and the number marker afterwards. That's one thing that differs. Example from Marisheva, you instead have the number then the tense. Younger Murimpata speakers, there's a lot of variation going on, but thanks to my student Luciana Keane, you can see a strong trend towards actually tense markers beginning to come more and more after the number markers, which implies then that the ordering in that one little way that it was different seems to be becoming more like the other languages in the area. This could potentially be an unconscious contact convergence effect that's bringing the ordering closer and closer together. And I just want to highlight, speakers are completely unconscious of this. No one ever can see what I'm asking about when I ask about these verb suffixes. So, from all that, I want to propose a hypothesis, a bold hypothesis, that in the processes of language change, there's quite separate mechanisms that the form of linguistic elements are being run by versus the ordering of linguistic elements. There's much previous research that talks about distinctions between lexicon and vocabulary, but especially due to those use of grammatical markers distinguishing dialects, I actually think that just talking more simply about form versus order is a cleaner way to talk about different mechanisms of language change. And my proposal is along the lines that under social contact and close interaction, at least within some cultures and some ontologies of language, the form of linguistic elements is actually driven apart through social contact. So there's form divergence, and meanwhile, the ordering of linguistic elements largely unconsciously becomes more similar through social contact and is not often subject to social identity work. So the implications of all this are that social contact does have a substantial role in differentiating languages around the world, and although we have recent research pointing in that direction, it's still not really part of the fundamental model of how language differentiates and changes. I believe this affects not just content words, but I have some reasons to think it may actually affect the grammatical markers in language as well. And furthermore, that there are distinct mechanisms of language change for the forms of language and the ordering of those forms. So where to from here in the future of this line of research? So I've been basically talking about a case study today. I've been cherry picking some fun data from the Daily region. But I do think that these point to wider patterns in language use with local cultural differences. So to study that further, we actually need broad global studies of language differentiation. We need global studies of how dialects become different from one another. And that's quite a challenge, but Howie Lee and Henry Leslie O'Neill have been working on that with me. And there's some interesting questions. If that is how language changes and we have these diversification mechanisms happening through cultural ideas about language and differentiation, how's that changing under globalization? You know, are those mechanisms being attenuated as we enter into urban industrialized societies, as we switch our communication into digital modalities? So that's all. Thank you very much for listening.
John, any questions for John? Up there, and then here you go first.
Thanks a lot. Hello? Yes. Thanks a lot, John, for a wonderful presentation. It resonates with work you probably heard of Michael Silverstein's paper on the limits of awareness, where he posits precisely segmentability, referentiality, kind of like prototypical nouns that you were talking about as being highly subject to conscious identification and therefore to be involved in this identity work. And there's the classic work of Gumpertz and Bloom, I think it is, in central India, which shows there's a similar area where the syntagmatic structures line up perfectly, but there are different lexical items plugged into them. But I was just wondering, and then the question you raised at the end was tantalizing. How does all this change under conditions where you have diaspora and people living together in urban settings, much more densely populated? And I know that's one thing you've been studying in your work in Darwin. So can you give us I'm sorry to distract you from the contents here, but it might be related and it might be involved.
Yeah, it's hard to give a really clear answer from Darwin. There's a few different things going on. People are still using Aboriginal languages in Darwin. In some cases, even I've met people who've grown up and spent most of their lives in Darwin, but still use an Aboriginal language as their first language, in particular Mudinpata. And there's there's new networks of multilingual exchange occurring in the city, and it is true that people do use Creole and English as a kind of lingua franca communicative mechanism, but they still also use some words and phrases from their distinct traditional languages. So for example, Mudinpata speakers and Anandiyakwa speakers using basically Creole English as a lingua franca, but also using elements of their languages which they do mutually learn, so that they can still also be using those markers of this is who I am and this is where I come from. Yeah.
Thanks, John. For me, this resonates with the distinction between sociolinguistic variables that are used to encode sort of social meaning,
Yes.
and linguistic variables that may or may not have social meaning, that may vary according to different grammatical factors, etc., but not necessarily social conditioning. Is that essentially the distinction you're making, or are you proposing something different here?
Yeah, it's very much along those lines, and yeah, didn't quite find room in this this particular presentation, but I'm actually drawing pretty heavily on the sociolinguistic tradition and attempts to pull apart which variables have social loading, with often it being talked about in terms of, that's where it often gets talked about as lexical and phonological stuff, is what's I think often pointed out as doing the social indexing work or social signalling, and grammar as being to some extent outside of that and being more just linguistically controlled. And that's where I'm taking a slightly different twist on that and saying actually just forms versus order is a cleaner way of talking about that. Partly, so you've got like Lebov's proposals where it's more like surface. I think at least one of Lebov's formulations talks about it in terms of the surface versus the underlying structure, where the underlying structure is just linguistically conditioned and it's the surface stuff that gets socially conditioned. I find that just difficult because then you need a theory of what's the surface and what's the underlying, so it gets a bit theory dependent.
But you're limiting it to order? I mean, what about all sorts of other grammatical stuff that isn't necessarily order, that is often less sensitive to social?
Right. So yeah, so which parts of grammar do we want to talk about, and what do we mean by grammar anyway? Takes us well into the weeds. So you've got your grammatical, your grammatical forms like your affixes and function words. Those do seem to, in the daily, quite often actually distinguish very nearby dialect groups. And it's certainly, at least in terms of, there was a verbal prefix there I mentioned where people do point to it as something that distinguishes their dialects. This other study that I've got going with Hao-Yi and Henry, we did a kind of broader survey that also suggests that actually grammatical markers quite often distinguish close neighbouring dialects. So that's one way of thinking about what grammar is. Then there's a whole other way of what are your semantic categories in grammar, and do people tend to have the same semantic grammatical categories or not when they're in close contact? And to that, I do not know the answer, but I would love to know.
Yeah, behind you.
Thanks, John. I was just thinking about your, if I remembered it correctly, so the order that converges, and part of that, you said something about it being largely unconscious, and speakers don't recognise it and are unconscious of it. And I'm just wondering, so the example you've given here is a morphological example, and I'm wondering whether you would expect that if, in a different situation where you have word order, syntactic order that's converging, are you also suggesting that would be something speakers are unconscious of as well?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think I've been a bit careful about saying that I think ordering is only rarely taking a role in social signalling. There do seem to be a few exceptions. You've got a thing in Northern England where Manchester people say "give me it" instead of "give." There's some little difference in Northern England. And, they say "give it me" instead of "give me it," and people I think are pretty aware of that. You've got quite a few places in the world. There's quite often actually internal noun phrase orderings that turns up a bit in dialectal differences. We found that in a study with Henry and Hao-Yi. So there's actually just not much research on whether those ordering differences can be socially salient. So Catherine's, you've worked on the Spanish, have you been involved in the ones with the Spanish object thingos? Those don't seem to be, so your Spanish kind of object pronouns or clitics, those can move around and people don't seem to put any social signalling on that. And then you've got this English particle verb thing like, pick them up, pick them up or pick up them, sorry.
Take out the garbage, take the garbage out.
Yeah, take out the garbage, take the garbage out. And that actually has little regional differences, it turns out, in the frequencies people use, but no one ever seems to consider that to have social value either.
So when you talk about speakers being unconscious of it, or the convergence, being unconscious. What you're meaning is it doesn't have a social significance. I interpreted it to mean they're unaware of it, but what you're saying is they could be aware of it, but it just doesn't.
No, sorry, I'm conflating that. In this case, I mean both. Both, it doesn't carry social signaling, and people are very unconscious of it, because I spent ages asking people about it, and no one knew what I was even talking about. They really don't notice the difference between one or the other, or at least if they do notice it, they don't want to talk about it. But yeah, there's two things there, and I'm very happy that consciousness came up earlier in Felicity's thing, because we often talk about that in sociolinguistics of like, what are people conscious of, but then that takes a bit of digging into like different levels and ways of being conscious of things.
We have time for one final question there in the middle.
Thanks, John. Just deviating a bit here, I was just curious about the story you told about Raphael and the part of your talk about the moral obligation. I was just wondering, did you have any experience with other speakers where they had initially told you that they didn't speak another language and then did, and is there some kind of custom or cultural practice tied to that moral obligation that causes speakers not to speak a certain language until they go over the line into other land or something like that? Thanks.
I think I haven't experienced it often on country. The people the people I've been closest to, the first people I was really close to actually lived really far away, so I never got to go to their country with them. And then after that, people I've been closest to are like this family from Yakieda. So that's the only example I can really draw on there. You do hear, I certainly think I've read similar examples mentioned in other parts of Australia. Alberto Furlan talked about similar thing happening in this region. But you give me a chance for another nice story where a guy I work with a lot, whose country was far away, and his real language, his ancestral language is Maringar, and he always essentially deny any ability to speak Maringar if I asked him about it. And one time we left Wadia and gone to a capital city, and he got a bit drunk, and then he started like yelling out at the moon in Maringar, which is kind of cool. Yeah, we're really far away from country, but he just, I don't know, it just brought up strong feelings for him, and he started yelling and Maringar.
Please join me in thanking John.